Welcome to the Extraordinary Podcast, where we identify God's uncommon work in common life. Recognizing God's work requires intentionality, but articulating it motivates and inspires. Don't forget to subscribe to never miss an episode. Hello, welcome to today's podcast. It's going to be a little different than normal, and you may remember last December in 2022, did an episode similar to this where it just kind of provided some reflections at the end of the year. And while that one provided some different reflections and of what happened during the first year, this one is kind of going to be a little bit more concluding. And in the sense of this will be kind of the last episode, or the last regularly published episode. We may have more episodes that come when we have guests or other various reasons, but in general, this is going to be the last episode that we regularly publish every Friday. And as I look back and think about this podcast and what we've done, I have a few thoughts. First off, this is the 100th episode. When I started this, I had no idea what to expect. And I remember in 2021, getting into late summer into the fall, one of the things that I realized is that God was doing powerful things in our church. That God was moving, He was working the lives of individuals, but so much of what the church was producing at that point was just me. And so while a podcast episode talking about that might seem a little odd, the reason we started the podcast was to explore what God was doing in the lives of individuals, not just those on staff or those in specific leadership positions, because God is alive and active in the life of people who are faithful to Him. So if you're a believer in Jesus, God is active in your life, and He wants to be active in your life. And so the name of the podcast is Extraordinary, God's Uncommon Work in Common Life. So for these last 100 episodes, we've explored how God is on the move, how God is active, how God is doing things in the life of His people. And it was really, really fun. It was fun to sit with you and to hear your story and allow you to speak. Now, I visited people, I've had conversations, and so I knew a lot of the guests that were on the podcast, but this was a unique opportunity for people really to share their story in an intentional way. And it was such a privilege to do that. And so I'm grateful for all the individuals who agreed to be guests on this podcast. And as I think back of the podcast, there were so many fun moments. At the beginning, a lot of the fun moments revolved around uncertainty, not knowing what we were doing. And there was some anxiety with that, in the sense of we may try to record an entire episode and it not work. And I'd have to ask the person to do it again. Now, fortunately, it never happened. There were a couple times we re-recorded an episode because the guests wanted to re-record it. And that was great. Because this podcast wasn't to try to make people feel uncomfortable. It wasn't to try to push them and put them in a corner. It was to allow God's story to be shared from our lives. And so part of the fun, or my favorite memories, are just hearing your stories. And as I come to that realization, I hope it challenges you to share your story. It can be really hard to do that sometimes because we have a fear of rejection, a fear if people will actually find our story relevant or meaningful, fear that people might not actually care enough about us. And while some of that may be true, we may try to share our story and somebody not care. That's hard. But the reason we share our story is not for our gratification. The reason we share our story is because we're working to glorify Jesus. because that's what our lives are about. Now, on the other side of things, there were a few pieces of this that I can't say I super enjoyed. One of those was the processing side of things wasn't always super easy or convenient. And, technology sometimes allows you to do things easily and sometimes it doesn't. And that's just part of life. And so I don't want to bemoan the point, but to recognize that there were some times where it wasn't super easy. And with that, there was some burden that was placed. One of the commitments I made to each guest was that I would go back to watch and listen to the recording to make sure it's something we could be proud of. Now, there were some episodes where the audio wasn't super great or there's some glitches here or there, but in general, everything was good. And so sometimes the audio was better or worse, and I can't say we attempted to claim that we are a high-grade professional outfit here, but we tried to do things in ways that we could be proud of. And I hope you can look back on these podcast episodes and say that they were meaningful, that the effort that the guests gave made a difference, that what we produced helped us know each other and understand who Jesus was to a greater degree. Now, one of the things that was always interesting is this is my 100th episode, so I'm pretty comfortable, relatively speaking, in this particular setting. Most of you were not comfortable. And I hope I showed empathy and care for you in that. But almost every episode had a moment where the guests got comfortable, where we could see that they relaxed. And part of it is it's such an odd setting that we're in my office, and if you've been in my office, it's a mess. You're only seeing one part of the wall here. Behind the camera, it's not something that is camera worthy. There's stuff all over my desk. The bookshelf is a mess. My jacket's lying right there on the couch. And so it's not a naturally comfortable setting for us. But each guest got comfortable. And part of what I recognize from that is when we talk about Jesus, when we share our story, there are things that may seem uncomfortable. They may not be convenient or what we're used to doing. But once we make the effort and get the ball rolling, then things can move in a positive way. And we understand what we're trying to do. And we just really get comfortable. And so part of what I want to do is to challenge you to continue to share your story and how Jesus is working in your story. It may be uncomfortable at first. In fact, it almost always is. But the more we share, the more comfortable we get. And I believe the more comfortable we get, the more that Jesus can shine through. Because that's what we're trying to do. I was talking to somebody recently who asked had a person they knew who was curious about Jesus. And they said, what should I do? And while there are many different approaches, in that moment, I gave a specific suggestion, and it was essentially just tell your story. What does Jesus mean to you? Because no matter how good of an arguer you are, it's almost impossible to argue somebody to Jesus. You're not going to debate and convince somebody to come to Jesus in most cases. But if you say, this is who Jesus is to me. This is what Jesus means to me. This is how I have experienced Jesus. That's a compelling testimony. It's a compelling story. It's a compelling witness. And while the person may not believe it, may not buy it, they may not be changed from it, what Jesus has done for me, how Jesus has met me, is the best way that I can share Jesus with someone else. So that was what we were trying to do with this podcast of God's uncommon work and common life. Because we're all living our lives. We're doing our things. We heard stories about medical issues, about relational issues, about financial issues. We heard all of these. See, we're all going through things. And sometimes we can forget that. And particularly in our world today, we can isolate ourselves so intensely that we make the other person not a person. And our media does this often in a fantastic way. When I say fantastic, I mean an effective way, not a good way. They say the other side is the enemy. And if we don't sit down and hear each other's stories, then it's real easy to forget that we are friends, that we are part of the family of God, that we are connected and unified through Jesus. See, if we don't sit down and do that, there's a tendency just to push each other away. And so the last 2 years, these 100 episodes, have, in my opinion, brought a lot of positive things to light. And every once in a while we hear people say, well, I didn't know this about that person. While those things are good, they can be beneficial, the point is not just knowing facts about another person. It's about getting to know each other in deep, meaningful ways. And so I can think of the different struggles individuals have gone through, some of their anecdotal stories, and you can go back and you can hear some of these. But the point is not that we know these anecdotes, these stories about each other, but that we take the time to know each other. And this also points to Jesus. Jesus doesn't want us just to know facts about him. Jesus wants us to know him intimately. And to know Jesus intimately means we have to spend time in his presence. Whether that's worshiping him corporately on Sunday morning, to worshiping him as you're singing with the radio driving in your car. We have to spend time with Jesus. Now, time with Jesus, we have to be careful that if we just squeeze Jesus into our lives, that's likely not going to provide the depth of a relationship that we need. And it's going to be surface level, and we're going to be disappointed and frustrated in many ways because of it. And so we get to know Jesus. Now, when we do get to know Jesus, we're going to want to do things like read the Bible and know about him. We're going to want to know facts about Jesus. But knowing facts about Jesus stems from our love of Jesus, because we want to be shaped by him. And so one of the things of this podcast that I just think has been super positive is it's opened our eyes to the fact that Jesus is working in us. I remember there's a person who had on the show, and I was amazed at how much this individual had grown since I had known them. And so I've been here 5.5 years now, and thinking back to how that person was when I first came to when they were on the podcast, even today, it's just taking a step back and saying, God, thank you for working in our lives. I think sometimes we miss that. Sometimes we fail to see the progress, the impact, the transformation that Jesus is doing in us because we don't take a step back to look at it. Because you can look at your own life, you can say, well, where was I 5 years ago? Or 10 years ago, or however long you want to say. Unless we intentionally do that, we run the risk of missing the significance. So if God really is doing uncommon work in common life, In order for us to see it, we have to take the time to look for it. And I hope you do that. Not only in your own life, but in the life of others. How has God moved in their lives? How has God helped them grow? What has God done through them? So just think about that. And maybe you start with yourself, maybe you start with somebody else. But I think that's one of the positive things that the podcast has done, is it makes us take a step back and articulate, what has God done? And many of the episodes featured individuals sharing lengthy time periods of their life, whether we're talking about 30, 40, 50 years of what God has done in and through them throughout their lives. And if we don't take time to contemplate that and to ponder the decades, the years that God has been moving in us, we sometimes can forget. And sometimes it's like the phrase, you can't see the forest for the trees, of you're so engulfed in this situation that you can't actually see all that's happening. So when we take a step back, we may still be in a situation that's hard or difficult, whatever that may be. But if we take a step back, we can see, God has worked in the past. And if God has worked in the past, I can trust that he's going to work into the future. So I hope you do that. I hope this podcast has helped you see that in your life and in others. But as I've said a few times here, this is the 100th episode. I didn't dream that we would have 100 episodes. I started this having commitment from 4 individuals. And I remember going into it, I didn't know if we'd even have a 5th episode. But we had a 5th and a 6th and a 7th, all the way to today's episode, 100. And I'm humbled by the fact that we've been able to do this. When I say we, it's not just me pointing the camera and just letting it go. It's we in the sense of the individuals who gave of their time, who shared their story, who allowed themselves to be vulnerable so that God's story could be shared through them. So I'm so grateful for the fact that we're able to do this. And there are several people to thank. I need to start with Becky Johnson, our office administrator. The first 3 or 4 months were just a complete scramble to try to get this podcast off the ground. And Becky would faithfully sit in the podcast room in my office as I would interview and have a conversation with a guest. And she would faithfully sit here and try to be as quiet as possible as to not be a distraction. She helps edit. She gets the emails ready to send out. She does so many things with this, and I just want to say thank you to Becky for that. And I also want to thank all the guests. And we've had over 100 guests between our episodes, and so that means over 100 people have taken time out of their lives to share. And so I want to say thank you. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for your time and your willingness. Thank you for how you've allowed Jesus to use you. I also want to say thank you to the church. We are B1 Naz, you can see with the sign, Burlington First Church of the Nazarene in Burlington, Iowa. And primarily, this has been about the people in this church. We've had guests from different agencies in the community, different church leaders from other places, former pastors, those types of things. But thank you to the church for allowing me to do this. It's been a privilege. It's been a wild ride. It's been a lot of fun. And I hope it's been beneficial. I also want to say thank you to the listeners. Thank you to those who watch or listen every week or most weeks. Your feedback has been valuable. I'm grateful for the fact that you find this beneficial. This wouldn't have been worth it if nobody was finding it beneficial. I also want to say thank you to Hannah, my wife, who was somebody I could bounce ideas off of, who would give me insights and suggestions to help me as a person, but also to help me be able to do this better. I'm just so grateful to have such a wonderful wife, and I'm just so grateful for her. So we may have some more episodes in the future. When we have guest speakers or missionaries or something like that, we might have additional episodes. But in general, this will be the last episode that we publish on a regular basis. I'm sad, but I'm also satisfied. I think what God has done in and through this has been good. It has been beneficial for us, been beneficial for me, and it's been something that we've been able to use to articulate that God is alive and active in us still. So as you go throughout your life, I'm going to challenge you to keep looking for extraordinary. Look for God's uncommon work in common life. Look for how God can use your story to impact others. It's been a privilege. Thank you. And God bless. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. Be on the lookout for how God does uncommon work in common life. And please subscribe to never miss an episode.